Okay, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of the day. It's Dave Cramer. Dave Cramer has been making ebooks for 15 years and complaining about ebook standards for nearly as long. He was co-editor of the IDPF specification on fixed layout ebooks, but in recent years has become heavily involved with the W3C and web standards, editing several specs. Honestly. No. So sorry. It's early in the morning. My eyes aren't working quite right. Okay, editing several specs for the CSS working group and writing requirements for Latin text layout and pagination for the digital publishing interest group. When not doing standards work, Dave writes XSL, works on typesetting with HTML and CSS, hunts for interesting information in mountains of XML files, and skis up and down literal mountains, preferably in Canada. He dreams of bringing the rich history of print design and typography to ebooks and the web. So welcome, Dave Cramer.
Thank you, Laura. So what are ebooks for? We've spent 20 years making, selling, and reading ebooks. Are they a force for good or for evil? How would we tell? How can we make ebooks better? Before we get to the ebooks of tomorrow, let's look back to see how we got here. Everyone likes to start talking about the history of ebooks by mentioning some white guy named Bush. I'm going to start with a Hispanic woman named Robles. 70 years ago, in 1949, a Spanish teacher named Ángela Ruiz Robles wanted to solve a problem. Her students had to carry too many heavy books. And so she invented a mechanical book, the Encyclopedia Mechanica, with text on spools like typewriter ribbons. Probably all of you are too young to remember typewriter ribbons. The encyclopedia could do many things. Students could read in the dark because of a built-in light. Teachers could add their own content. There was a magnifier for people with visual disabilities. A prototype was created, but the idea never took off. But this was the first step towards the digital books of today. What was this for? To make books available to everyone, regardless of ability or disability, to tailor the content to the reader, to allow more people to contribute to books, to be authors, and to have a library at your fingertips. These ideas will resonate through the next 70 years, a veritable lifetime. 22 years later, it was 1971. There were now mainframe computers. 15 of them were connected to ARPANET, which would eventually become the internet. A kid named Michael S. Hart, whose mom broke codes during World War II, started attending the University of Illinois. His brother's best friend was the mainframe computer operator and gave Michael virtually unlimited computer time, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. On July 4th, the US Independence Day, which is like Canada Day but with more guns, he went and watched fireworks and stopped at a grocery store afterwards. They stuffed a copy of the US Declaration of Independence in his shopping bag. Rather than using all that computer time to do data processing, he thought, why not give something back to people? He typed the Declaration of Independence into the computer. His first instinct was to send a copy to everyone via a precursor to today's email. If he had been allowed to do that, he would have invented spam. But some wise person said no, so he decided to make the text available to download. This was the first ebook and the start of Project Gutenberg. The format was simple, ASCII text in all caps. Having spent the last 7 years working on ebook specifications, I think this was the greatest idea in history. By 1986, he'd typed 313 titles himself, but then the project expanded to other sites and other volunteers. Now there are 59,000 books in Project Gutenberg. For all you typography geeks, he wrote all his emails with a fixed width font and justified the text by choosing words carefully. Not only did he invent ebooks, but he set a precedent for unbearable authors, which we live with to this day. Time passed, computers became more common. Instead of 15 computers on the internet in 1971, there were around 44 million by 1995. Project Gutenberg made books available digitally, but what kind of books, impossible in print, became possible in digital? In 1995, Shelley Jackson wrote Patchwork Girl. What if Mary Shelley's Frankenstein were true? What if Mary Shelley herself made the monster, not the fictional Dr. Frankenstein? And what if the monster was a woman and fell in love with Mary Shelley and traveled to America? Today we glibly talk about choose-your-own-adventure stories. Here was a real pioneer of hypertext fiction, stories which branched, which could be many different narratives, stories which hadn't been told in print. I guess you could say I want my fiction to be more like a world full of things that you can wander around in, rather than a record or memory of those wanderings. This was something new, technology enabling nonlinear art. Jackson kept pushing the boundaries of format. Her short story, Skin, is 2,000 words long, with each word tattooed on the body of a different volunteer. Only the volunteers will get to read the story. As they die, the story changes, and when the last word dies, the story will be gone. This reminds us that not all stories can be digitized, and that there are those of us who will transcend even our most ambitious visions. By the late 1990s, Silicon Valley was full of money and gadgets. It was becoming possible to create dedicated ebook readers. 3 companies were working on them: SoftBook, Nuvo Media, and Microsoft. They thought there should be a standard around ebooks. They formed the Open eBook Forum and started writing the first OEB spec. Here we see the Rocketbook from Nuvo Media and the SoftBook from SoftBook. Microsoft's reader wasn't a standalone gadget, but ran on Windows desktops and Pocket PCs. Nuvo Media wanted a big investment from Amazon, but Jeff Bezos eventually said no because he wanted an exclusive relationship. He doesn't seem to apply that same principle to his personal life. After being rejected by Amazon, both Barnes & Noble and Bertelsmann, which owns Random House, invested $2 million each in Nuvo Media. I think that's the only time a publisher actually spent real money on ebooks. The spec writing process was driven by Microsoft engineer Jerry Dunietz with SoftBook's Garth Conboy and Nuvo Media's David Ornstein. 20 years later, Garth is still involved, as are George Kirscher, shown here with his famous guide dog Nesbitt, and Brady Duga. It's crazy that I get to hang out with the people who invented EPUB. Of the 25 people listed in the first OEB standard, only one was a woman, Kate Hughes from Microsoft. That very first ebook spec, OEB 1.0, came out on September 11th, 1999, bundled with a sample ebook about Ebola, of all things. It was pretty simple: a single HTML file and an OPF file that would be completely familiar to anyone working with EPUB today. But back then, there was no container, no OCF, just a folder. 19 years later, I took that original OEB, put it in a modern container, and made it into an EPUB. It had so many validation errors that I had to give EPUB Check the rest of the day off, but I was able to open it in Calibra. I started making ebooks a couple of years later, around 2001 or 2002. It wasn't exactly big business. The Rocketbook was gone by 2003. You could read books on a Palm Pilot, but not many people did. In 2005, Amazon finally bought an ebook startup, MobiPocket, which had a reading system that didn't quite understand CSS. But 2007 was the momentous year for the ebook world. The iPhone came out in June. The first version of EPUB, EPUB 2, it's a long story, came out once again on September 11th. The Kindle came out in November 2007, long before Jeff Bezos was blackmailed by the National Enquirer after the government of Saudi Arabia had hacked his phone to obtain sex to his mistress at the request of the President of the United States' family. But this was the ebook revolution. We sold millions of books instead of thousands. We didn't have to make 6 different formats for each book, just EPUB. EPUB 2 wasn't perfect, of course, but it was good enough for a lot of trade publishing. 4 years later, work began on a new version. Why? EPUB had always depended on HTML to express content, but a modest revolution was brewing in the HTML world with the development of HTML5, which included semantic elements like article and section and aside. So EPUB 3 moved to HTML5, both for content and for the critical navigation document. Perhaps for the first time, EPUB was moving in the direction of the mainstream web. EPUB 3 came out in October of 2011. The fixed layout spec came out in March 2012, but no one started using EPUB 3. First of all, the IDPF had a bad habit of finishing specs before implementations existed. They built it, but no one came. HTML5 was awesome, but CEOs didn't really care about semantics, and a lot of reading devices were never going to support audio and video. Publishers tried fancy enhanced ebooks, but they were hard to make and never really had a reason to exist. Hachette put out a book where David Baldacci took you on a video tour of his office. It's hilariously bad. Fixed layout did gain a market, partly because it was possible to create FXL in a semi-automated fashion. And as I said, EPUB 2 was good enough for lots of people. There were lots of old e-readers out there which were never updated. After 3 or 4 years, most big publishers started using EPUB 3, but it was still designed to be backward compatible with EPUB 2. We don't do anything fancy. Nothing ever changes. And even big publishers still make crappy ebooks, which was the subject of my very first public talk 10 years ago. Nothing ever changes. Around 2013, the W3C, which is responsible for web standards like HTML and CSS, began talking to the publishing industry. EPUB was already based on web technologies, but what could the web learn about books, and what could we learn about the web? While IDPF and W3C were getting to know each other, work continued on EPUB in the IDPF. So let me tell you the sad tale of the EPUB spec that never was EPUB 3.1. The goal of 3.1 was to make a simpler, cleaner, and better EPUB. We wanted better alignment with web standards. We wanted a more readable specification. We wanted to get rid of some obsolete features which conflicted with web standards. We wanted to bring EPUB into the mainstream of the web by allowing, well, HTML without the X. We wanted exploded EPUBs that weren't zipped up so they could work on web servers. But it didn't work. Reading systems didn't like the idea of using HTML because some of them processed EPUB using XML tools. They hadn't seen Liam's workshop yesterday. The browser-friendly format seemed too big a step for 3.1, but did end up inspiring web publications. Worst of all, EPUB Check, the validation tool for EPUB, was in trouble. It had always depended on volunteer developers, but the well had run dry. And the entire EPUB ecosystem depends heavily on validation. Most retailers won't even process an ebook that doesn't pass EPUB Check. So if EPUB Check didn't support 3.1, literally no one would use it. And that's what happened. 3.1 was finalized as the merger between W3C and IDPF was finalized, but it didn't matter. After the merger, responsibility for EPUB 3 maintenance fell to the new EPUB 3 community group. Garth Conboy, who wrote the first ebook spec, and Makoto Murata proposed that we roll back EPUB 3.1 and make an update that was focused on backward compatibility. Even the name proved controversial, as some wanted to call it 3.0.2, but we couldn't just pretend that 3.1 never happened. The main idea was to keep the good stuff from 3.1, the evergreen relationship with HTML and CSS, the better spec organization, but roll back things that affected compatibility. Every 3.01 file is already valid EPUB 3.2, even if it doesn't know it yet. And we've done this. The work is largely complete on the spec and the community group. And best of all, EPUB Check will support EPUB 3.2. The release candidate came out yesterday, thanks to Svea, Rachel, and Luke, who spearheaded a fundraising effort, Iris, who designed the cool t-shirt that all the cool kids there are wearing, and of course, Roman, who did all the coding. So go buy a t-shirt and support EPUB Check. Here's a quick list of some of the new stuff in EPUB 3.2. It's awesome, but it's still just EPUB 3, so you don't really need to get worked up or change your workflows. And that brings us to today, Judgment Day. How are we doing? What problems have we solved? What problems do we need to solve? In many ways, EPUB has fulfilled the promises of Angela Ruiz Robles and Michael S. Hart. We do have libraries in our pockets. We can fly to Toronto with 556 EPUBs on our laptop. I did think it would be more. Many more people can read books and make books. You don't need to buy a printing press to publish a book. But there are so many things we still can't do, and we're stuck. That revolution was 12 years ago. Last fall, in one of my rare ranty moods, I started posting all the things I hated about EPUB on Twitter. You know, we have this massive interop problem. You can't really link to inside an ebook from the web. Ebooks don't fit in the web security model, so we mostly can't use JavaScript. The lack of pagination in browsers causes lots of bugs. CSS really hasn't caught up with thousands of years of book design. Reading systems mess with our books via overrides. Lots of the regular web stuff doesn't work. And it's just hard to make good EPUBs. There's a lot of bad tools out there in design. So what do we do now? How do we get unstuck? So the W3C is trying to create the next generation of ebooks, something called web publications. What is a web publication? The first sentence of the spec isn't really that helpful. Maybe we can figure it out ourselves. So what's a publication? We have some content files that probably have to occur in a certain order. We want chapter 2 to come after chapter 1. We have supporting files like cover images and CSS. We have metadata. In fact, we can think of publications as being defined by 3 things. The sequence, what comes first, what comes next. The boundary, what's part of the publication, what isn't. And metadata, tell me more about the publication as a whole. EPUB has its own way of describing these things using the XML of the package file. The spine defines the sequence. The manifest lists everything in the publication, thus defining its boundary. And there's a section for metadata. You all know how this gets expressed in regular EPUB. The metadata has the yellow background. The manifest here is peach. The spine is green. In web publications, we just use slightly different terms. We call the ordered list of primary resources the reading order. Everything else that's part of the publication but not in the reading order is a resource. And there's the usual metadata. So far, this doesn't seem that different than EPUB. But how do we write this information down? The dreaded JSON. What would be the OPF file in EPUB is called the manifest. And rather than finding it from container.xml, you link to it from the URL of your web publication. This is the manifest for a simple book, sort of a mini Moby Dick. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is not designed for human readability. Comments are illegal. If you forget a comma or a quote, it fails. The metadata is now described with the schema.org vocabulary, which Google uses to show you movie reviews and search results. That doesn't seem so bad, but what have we gained? We've written EPUB in JSON. If that's all we do, what's the point? We have almost the same advantages and disadvantages as EPUB. The real promise of web publications, I think, comes down to a single idea. We want books without reading systems. We want to be part of the web with all the power that affords us. We want grid and script and local storage. We want to use our familiar browsers, and we want to use the assistive technology that we already know. We don't want to hear, that doesn't work on Kindle. We want dev tools. We want tools, period. We want standards we can count on. We want it all. But with power comes responsibility. What we forget about ebooks is that we, as content creators, abdicate almost all responsibility for the user interface, for how ebooks work. We may draw the picture, but it's someone else's frame and someone else's museum. And it's someone else's rules. As I was writing this, Amazon was discouraging publishers from using tables because they don't work so well on the Kindle. That's horrible. You can put publications on the web today, but you have to figure out how to allow readers to turn the page, to find the table of contents, to remember where they left off. That's a ton of work and a ton of JavaScript, a whole bunch of skills that most publishers don't have. And like everyone except Facebook and Google, we don't know how to make money on the web. We should give the publishing industry some credit. We sell digital stuff for cash money without advertising. At least some authors get paid, and that's really, really important. Everything I've seen in the publishing working group suggests that we are rebuilding the old system. In spite of all the JSON and all the talk about the web, we're going to create bundles of content and send them to distributors and retailers who will build complex software environments to display the ebooks. They will be web publications in name only. Redium is already building this. In fact, much of this technology is just the internal file format they use for EPUB. We're being asked to throw away 20 years of EPUB for the convenience of a few developers. And we tell ourselves that browsers will eventually support web publications. No browser vendors are participating in the working group, except for Google, and their ebook people have little influence over their browser. Representatives of every browser have expressed reservations about how we are doing this work. I'm afraid we're not solving any problems. On Friday, I was talking to Brian Cardell, the author of the Extensible Web Manifesto. He points out we really haven't been writing specs like HTML or EPUB for all that long, compared to the scale of human history, and we're still learning how to do it. So many specs in the EPUB world have just disappeared without a trace. Advanced hybrid layouts, anyone? Dictionaries and glossaries, indexes, multiple renditions, widgets, EPUB. This is what we get for writing specs before knowing what is needed. I fear web publications will be another example. Brian talks about the importance of figuring out the best way to do something before writing a spec. Writing a spec should be like paving the cow paths, but first you need to know where the cows want to go. Should I be using this metaphor in Calgary instead of Toronto? Jquery was a classic example, a big JavaScript library that contained all sorts of really useful and convenient features, but many of them ended up becoming parts of regular JavaScript. The picture element was first built as a custom element, and after much experimentation became a part of HTML. So what if we wanted a footnote element in HTML? Instead of just arguing with spec editors, which we've tried to do and failed, we should build a custom element, which can be done in today's browser with a bit of script. The script can control how the element renders as well as provide user interaction. And so we just try it out. People might have different ideas about how it should work, but that's exactly what we need. We hope that all of us together, experimenting, arguing, engaging with real use cases, will come up with something better than a bunch of people on a conference call once a week. If we know what we want, how it works, and can demonstrate a need, then it's much more likely that the browsers will implement the new thing and that it can then become a native and declarative part of the platform. Imagine a custom book element that would provide controls for moving between chapters. That would truly be a web publication. Nothing is stopping us from trying that. I once made a custom audiobook player which takes a list of audio elements and plays them in sequence. So easy, even an old white dude can do it. But there are some things JavaScript just can't do. What if you want a responsive design with non-rectangular tiles, rough borders on a box, curved separators between elements? Project Houdini might be the answer, browsers allowing developers access to the machinery that the browsers themselves use to lay out pages. You can invent your own CSS. This is shipping soon in a browser near you. So what do? Maybe we take both roads. We make today's EPUB better. We experiment and work with the browsers to make the web better for publications. There's been a lot of talk about convergence, but maybe that means building a bridge, working incrementally from both sides of the gulf between EPUB and the web, instead of trying to build something entirely new in the middle of a river. Maybe EPUB 4 can be the child of EPUB 3, not the child of web publications. We keep the core of EPUB. We allow HTML without the X. We jettison some of the non-webby features like the NCX, or features which were never really adopted like multiple renditions. We can more carefully define the roles and responsibilities of reading systems to improve interoperability. We can make tests. On the web side, we can incubate new ideas for making publications better, many of which would work inside or outside of EPUB or web publications. My favorite would be allowing URLs to point to inside an iframe, which would make web publications so much easier. But we need to think about what we build. In 1973, Ivan Illich wrote a great little book called Tools for Conviviality. What tools help us as individuals, as citizens, as a society? What tools enhance our lives without oppressing us, without making us the tools? A bicycle is a lovely thing. It can be built on a small scale. It can be repaired by its owner. It enhances the power of its rider without doing harm to others. It leaves us healthier and happier. Cars are much more fraught. They must be built on an industrial scale. It's even illegal to fix them yourself sometimes. They've altered the character of cities, killed millions of people, and contributed to global warming. Do they do more harm than good? I don't know. How do we make ebooks more like bicycles than cars? Ebooks have made both reading and making books open to many more people. Ebooks can be accessible. You can make them at home with relatively simple tools. Yes, we have walled gardens, but we can grow books at home too. In some sense, that was the promise of the early web. HTML was transparent. You could view source, change something, refresh, see what happened, figure it out on your own. In that sense, HTML was a tool of conviviality. Many of us figured out ebooks in much the same way. I don't want to lose that possibility. The web is going through a phase where everything is getting more complex, harder to understand. There's so much script. HTML and CSS are seen as primitive, backwards. CSS is even being devalued as girl stuff. Your nonprofit newsletter page is supposed to use React because Facebook uses it, but you don't have thousands of developers or billions of users. I worry that this will happen to ebooks. The early signs from web publications aren't promising. We will need complex JavaScript just to make books readable offline. We might need even more complex tools to make packages. HTML and XML were explicitly designed to be human readable. That's not true for JSON or HPAC or CBOR. We become more dependent on our tools, more dependent on the wizards. But sometimes we do need a few wizards to help us defeat Sauron. But how do we make it so they work for us rather than us serving them? That is our task. We need wizards to experiment, to incubate. We need all of you to remind us of what works and what doesn't, and more importantly, to remind us of what matters, the principles that have driven us for 70 years, making books available to everyone, making reading and writing and publishing accessible. Let's make ebooks tools of conviviality and issue our own declaration of independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all documents are created equal, that they are endowed by their authors with certain unalienable rights, that among these are perceivability, operability, understandability, and the pursuit of robustness. That to secure these rights, standards are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consensus of the working group. That whenever any form of standard becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to revise or to deprecate it and to institute new standards, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such format as to them shall seem the most likely to affect their validity and accessibility. Viva la revolution. Thank you.